of the dead. Black magic rites, jungle lords of race.
Hello, Howie Bentley here. Welcome to episode number 6 of Sword and Sorcery Heavy Metal. Today, Matthew Knight and I will be discussing The Hills of the Dead by Robert E. Howard. The Hills of the Dead is a Solomon Kane story. For further reading, I suggest that you pick up a copy of The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane, published by Del Rey. These are the unexpurgated texts and are exactly as Howard intended them. While I'm on the subject of recommendations, I would also suggest that you pick up a copy of Eternal Winter's Archaic Lore Enshrined. On that album is a song about the Solomon Kane story, The Hills of the Dead, as well as a number of other songs referring to classic sword and sorcery tales. Let's get on to the discussion. Hey, Matt.
Hey, Howie. How's it going?
How are you today?
Good. It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. Well, so we're discussing the Solomon Kane tale, The Hills of the Dead, today. And this tale was originally published in Weird Tales in, I believe it was August 1930. And to sort of put this in a little bit of context here within the whole sword and sorcery genre. So when we think of sword and sorcery, we generally think, who's the first character that comes to mind? To most people, I think it would be Conan, right? Sure. And that was definitely Howard's most popular character. But there were a number of other characters as well, and Solomon Kane being one of them. I think sword and sorcery, when we think of sword and sorcery, we tend to think of the barbarian type, like Conan. And of course, the prototype for Conan was Kull. And so these characters, they're barbarians, so they have they have their own worldview, so to speak, or perspective on things. So a lot of sword and sorcery characters that came after, say, Kull and Conan, for example, Elric, or Carl Edward Wagner's Kane, not to be confused with Solomon Kane, but those characters are more morally ambiguous characters than, say, Solomon Kane, because Solomon Kane was a Puritan and he was a Christian, a man of God. So the thing with Solomon Kane is he goes out and he hunts for the devil. He goes out and he hunts for wicked men and takes them down. Whereas a character like Conan would not necessarily do that. Conan's concerned about Conan. He's going out and doing what he has to do, and it's a self-serving thing. So that's a big difference in those two. And another difference is some of the supernatural elements in the stories. Now, it is thought of sword and sorcery, as far as the history of sword and sorcery, I think most sword and sorcery fans would agree that sword and sorcery was founded with the story The Shadow Kingdom, which was a Kull story. It was published in Weird Tales in 1929. I think that was it was August 1929. And of course, there were Solomon Kane stories that were, or one anyway, that was published before that same year. And that was the one published in January of 1929. And that was Skulls in the Stars. But in Skulls in the Stars, we don't have these elements of the barbarian and the wizard. The Skulls in the Stars was more about, it was more of a ghost story. There were supernatural elements there, but Howard wasn't quite on the sword and sorcery. He hadn't defined sword and sorcery yet. So that's one of the things. And also I'll mention that Solomon Kane, he's not, when you think of sword and sorcery, you think of these barbaric characters, and everything from Conan and Kull to Kane to Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser to, whoever. You think of these big brawny barbarian guys. But Solomon Kane is more of a he's like this rangy, wolfish type guy. He's almost gaunt, but he's still really strong and powerful. And in addition to carrying a sword, he also carries black powder guns. He carries a black powder rifle and a black powder pistol as well. So anyway, all of that being said, that's some of the difference there. And I think maybe, I mean, I love the Solomon Kane stories, but I think some of them did not have, you know, the wizard and the sword. I mean, they had the sword, but some of them were just action stories too. Like I think maybe the Blue Flame of Vengeance, I think was the name of the story. And others are just weird tales, but it's definitely sword and sorcery. The ones that have, and this story that we're going to discuss, The Hills of the Dead, is definitely a sword and sorcery tale. And one of the reasons I think this one came later, this was 1930, August 1930, I think it was, yeah, The Hills of the Dead. And I think by then, Howard was figuring out what Farnsworth Wright, the editor at Weird Tales, wanted. And he was trying to deliver that. And I think that what Farnsworth Wright wanted was sword and sorcery. And that's what Howard ended up doing with this tale. The Hills of the Dead is definitely a sword and sorcery story, right? So, also with this, you know, you have the heroic protagonist. Now, what is the sword and sorcery story? It's really a horror story but you have a heroic protagonist. Whereas in a true horror story, everybody in the story is doomed. If evil does not prevail at the end of a true horror story, rather, then you do not have a real horror story when you have survivors, right? I mean, there are exceptions, but for the most part. But in a sword and sorcery story, you have a horror tale is what it is, but you have a heroic protagonist with usually has a bladed weapon, a sword, or maybe an assortment of bladed weapons to go along with that. And that's what we have here in The Hills of the Dead. We have that heroic protagonist with Solomon Kane. And we also have a sorcerer. And he's kind of a human. He's not really, I don't want to call him a sidekick, but he's also there. He's kind of a comical. It's not comical in a campy way, but the character, he kind of lightens things up a little bit, even though they are pretty desolate and gloomy, especially this story. So his name is Inlonga, and he's an old, like a black African shaman. He's like not really a voodoo, because he said he learned white man magic too when he was a slave. So he's really, and he is much older than he appears to be. And he gives Solomon Kane the staff. Now, it starts off with Solomon Kane and Inlonga are talking about, or Solomon Kane is telling him that the jungle is calling him. Because that's one difference too, or I mentioned earlier already this, that Solomon Kane, he goes looking for evil. He goes looking for trouble. And he's going to go out and he's going to vanquish it. Right? So that he's telling Inlonga that the jungle's calling him, and he's got to go into the depths of the jungle, and he's got to fight the devil. He's got to fight wickedness. And he has this wanderlust about him that I don't think many of Howard's other characters had necessarily that one thing that drives them on, like Solomon Kane. So anyway, he's going into the jungle here, and he's going to find whatever's wrong, and he's going to right it. And of course, he comes up to put this in a nutshell now and try to wrap it up, because I know this is long-winded. But like I said, I wanted to give the viewers some context of what's going on here and how Solomon Kane fits into Robert E. Howard's body of sword and sorcery tales. But anyway, he goes into the jungle and he discovers, long story short, he meets this girl and discovers these vampires. And they are vampires in that they drink souls. They're kind of like the Elric sword. They drink souls. And already Inlonga has given him this arcane staff, this mysterious staff that he carries with him. And he is able to communicate with Enlonga over these great distances with this staff. So that's to his advantage. So he's already using sorcery, which is a kind of a peculiar thing, because this man's a Christian and he views sorcery as a bad thing, but at the same time he admits sometimes you need sorcery because he's basically fighting fire with fire, and he needs Enlonga's aid. So he discovers these this village of vampires and goes to butt heads with them. And that's the gist of the story, and I'm trying to avoid giving any spoilers away as to the ending or anything. But so, considering what I just said, do you have any thoughts on that? And go ahead and shoot what you've been thinking about the story there.
Yeah, sure. It's one of my very favorite sword and sorcery tales. It was the first Solomon Kane story I ever read. The first time I read it was in this anthology, the Elsbrog the Camp collection. And yeah, I was just really fascinated with the concept of the vampire being, in these savage lands. It wasn't, because you think of vampires, you think of, Dracula and Bela Lugosi and these sort of
Europeans.
Yeah, and this gothic element, that it's totally different in this context. So that just was really cool and exotic to me, and it reminded me of, I think of the time when Howard wrote this. There were a lot of kind of like exotic voodoo horror tales going on. You think about films like White Zombie, and there's a bunch of others that I can't think of right now, but a lot of these stories, and old time radio was real big with these types of stories too, where some guy who's an explorer, he goes on an expedition to Haiti or somewhere, comes back with some artifact, and then all of a sudden there's like this voodoo curse, and it often has to do with zombies. That's what you think of, but the fact that these creatures are referred to as vampires is just a real twist on the tale that I felt drawn to. And yeah, the character of Nlonga, or Enlonga, however you say it, he's a really cool element that I really liked. Now, he appears earlier in Red Shadows, I believe, and The Hills of the Dead is almost like a sequel to that, because in the story of Red Shadows, Solomon Kane witnesses Nlonga use the voodoo staff to animate dead man to get back at his nemesis and all this. So when he returns, it's sort of like their rendezvous is like a reunion of sorts, and he's just telling the Juju man how he's drawn to come back to this land and doesn't really know why, but like you say, he feels this call. And yeah, it just goes on to this, really excellent adventure that's quite different from anything else. Well, many things that I had read in the sword and sorcery genre, because again, that element of the exotic, of course, there's a lot of adventure tales that, go into these kind of more savage lands, but for sword and sorcery, I think it's a pretty unique thing as far as vampires, and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Enlonga he's one of the few friendly wizards. In Howard's stories, most of those sorcerers are bad news. I think there were some in The Hour of the Dragon. Of course, he was trying to pad that novel out into a novel, but there were, there's a Zaltoten is the evil sorcerer in that book, who's been resurrected from, thousands of years ago. But so Enlonga is probably the only good sorcerer I can think of in all of Howard's tales. Can you think of anyone else?
No, not really. And it's pretty interesting because, like you say, Solomon Kane's whole view on everything is, like you say, he's after evildoers, and whenever any kind of voodoo or supernatural thing happens, it's Satan, it's the devil. And that, I believe that adds because he's such a devout Christian and like a, really God-fearing Puritan, it makes these horrific supernatural elements even more frightening come from his point of view. So you can imagine Kane being the way he is, and then he's hooking up with this, this exotic voodoo man who's like aiding him in really wild ways. I mean, he's, trading souls with these other savages and whatnot, and it's pretty wild. So if you put yourself in the point of view of Solomon Kane, who's a heroic Puritan, that's some really wild stuff. And I think Nlonga's definitely a very unique character, and I can't think of very many other sorcerers in Howard's works that are on the side of the protagonist like he is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the staff, that he calls it, I think he called it a juju staff, or I don't remember the exact name he gave for it, but it's sort of an arcane staff. It's a magic staff, and that, if you you've read, I'm sure, the Footfalls Within, and he refers to that as this ancient staff that just goes way back. He even refers to Moses carrying this staff at one time, and that it was carried by magicians or shamans, sorcerers, whatever you want to call them, even long before that. So it has this history to it, and that's a really cool object. You think about these sword and sorcery tales. Yeah, magic swords. That's a very popular trope. I hate to use that word, but that's what comes to mind. Or a magic ring. But that's the object of power in the story, is that staff. And that's how when he's first beset by or set on by the vampires, how he manages to vanquish one of the vampires is with that staff.
Right.
I'm already kind of giving them. The story's not that long. I guess there's not that much to talk about unless I start giving things away about the story. So anyway, did you want to add anything else to that?
Well, one thing I will add is that when I was rereading it, because I've read the story, this might have been like my 5th time reading it, because again, I read it the first time and was really intrigued by it, and then reread it for fun. But then I wrote a song about it, and I wanted to reread it to really get into it, to write song lyrics. So it's been several years, and this time reading it, I came across some different things that I didn't remember, and I wonder if maybe they had some hidden meanings. I remember there's sort of at the beginning when Kane encounters the girl for the first time. There's all this going on with this lion chasing her and all that. He sees this serpent, and the serpent kind of goes into the grassland, and it's just mentioned really briefly. He says something about it having some human motion or something. That's all he says about it. I never really picked up on that, I didn't remember, reading that. But little things like that, this time around, I was picking up on, because the rest of it I was familiar with. But there's a lot of little details, and there were some other things like that, but I won't go, really into it, because I don't want to give it away for people who haven't read the story yet. But I did notice, just some small little elements that they might be there just for imagery, but it made me wonder if, there was more to it. I also noted when the girl character, I can't remember her name. She's a cool character too, but she is relating to him the history of the vampires, and she mentions like the battles or that have happened in the past with these vampires or something like that. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. It would be neat if there was more history to that. It makes you wonder. Yeah.
I'd forgotten about that point. I'm glad you brought that up. So maybe, the whole thing seems to be with Kane, and I already repeated myself a couple of times, but that he goes looking for the devil to do battle.
Right.
And with the serpent being there with these almost human sort of aura about her characteristics, it may have been, Howard may have very well been referring to the serpent in the Garden of Eden, or just the devil incarnate.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I kind of took from it. But it was something that I had overlooked before, because the other elements are so interesting that there's little things kind of skim past sometimes. But this time around, it was a lot of little things like that. There were these subtle kind of just undertones that were in there that I enjoyed. And the Solomon Kane stories to me they always have an element of the Gothic, and I don't know. I guess it's because he's like you said, he's not a Conan barbarian kind of guy. He's this kind of straightforward Puritan guy who's like walking around with a musket and a sword and all that. And a lot of the scenarios, you think of like the Castle of the Devil and a couple other ones where it sort of has this Gothic touch to it. And he's always exploring. I think several of them are like feature French. Matter of fact, Red Shadows I mentioned earlier features that Le Loup. He's like a French villain.
All right, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great one. Also, I believe the voodoo staff, so it's given to him in the story, but it's been a while since I've read the other tales. I think he hangs on to it and has other stories, right? And you see him on like the covers of the books and things like that. He's got the stave. So this is sort of like the introduction to his use of that, which is pretty cool.
I have to wonder too, how many movies or anime, I guess you would call them anime, have been influenced by this. I think of the image of the protagonist in Vampire Hunter D, for example. He's dressed like Solomon Kane.
Yeah, I've always thought that too. Yep.
Yeah, and another character is Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter. That movie reminded me of Solomon Kane when I first saw it.
Definitely. It's definitely, the same. And you know what? Yeah, there you go. Again, there's this, Puritan hunting vampires,
Right, Gothic feel to it.
Yeah.
So anyway, why don't you tell the viewers about your song? So, I mean, you could even cite some of the lyrics as to how they correspond to the story, maybe just some examples of that, and what really, obviously reading the story inspired the song, so I'm not going to ask you about the inspiration of the song, but both musically and lyrically, maybe you could tell us a little bit about its title, The Hills of the Dead, as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So that album, Archaic Lore and Shrine, is filled with just, like I said in a previous interview with you, it's just kind of my tribute to all my favorite sword and sorcery authors and my favorite stories. So The Hills of the Dead was featured. It's actually two songs. There's the song The Hills of the Dead, and then there is an intro piece that it has two titles. It's called Nosferatu Necronomica, and the subtitle is Voodoo Staff Fantasia. That is a pretty interesting piece where I'm actually playing an African drum. I have this antique, big African drum made of animal hide that I inherited from my great aunt, who had an importing and exporting company like back in the 60s. And I got this thing. So I thought, maybe I can use this one here. So in that particular piece, you'll hear me banging on this drum, and I'm singing in the voice of Enlonga, and it's a conversation piece between him and Solomon Kane, and it deals with the beginning of the tale, setting it all up like we just talked about. Then it goes into The Hills of the Dead, which is just a really ballsy, straightforward epic metal song. Got some proggy influences and everything, and just it's a pretty good one, I think. I'm very straight ahead with the narrative sort of lyrics. It's very storytelling. I'm just kind of, in my view, summarizing it in my little kind of poetic way, and it goes through some different vocal styles also. I'll say it sort of has an aggressive thrashy attack with my voice, but then goes into these kind of layered soaring parts, and then into a part towards the end where I'm dealing with the climax of the story, where there's some really heavy, aggressive, like gang vocal kind of things. I think some of the most hardcore ones I've ever done are in that story, or excuse me, in that song. So yeah, I just had a lot of fun with it, and it's pretty musically adventurous. We go into in the bridge section. There's like a really good keyboard solo by Keith, my keyboardist, and cool kind of wild, exotic musical part where everybody's kind of doing some different things, and I'm utilizing some exotic scales in the guitar solo. So yeah, a lot going on. It's a fun song, and I think I definitely would say it's probably the ultimate heavy metal tribute to Solomon Kane, because I haven't seen very many others.
Yeah, I don't know really of anyone. Now, I wrote a song called "The Right Hand of Doom."
That's
yeah,
right.
on that. But you know, in that story, Solomon Kane is pretty much off stage, and of course in the song, you know, definitely. But he's just there. He's just kind of hanging around town when all that goes down for the most part.
Yes.
What's that?
Yeah, that's a wild tale. It's a good one.
Yeah, that is a good one. And of course, you know, that was on the first Briton Rites album on For Mere Call, released in 2010. But other than those two songs, I can't think of anyone else who referred to. I mean, there are plenty of bands doing sword and sorcery stuff. Back when I started, even when you started, you know, you're much younger than I am, but even when you started, there weren't many guys doing this that were writing about these sword and sorcery tales like this. You know, there was Mark Shelton for Manila Road. He had a Conan story back in, or a song referred to a Conan story, I guess, late 70s. And I mentioned some of this stuff I repeat from other episodes, but he was the first one doing a song in reference to Conan's story, which was Queen of the Black Coast. But I don't know anyone who's done the Solomon Kane stuff. I'm sure somebody will probably let me know in the comments about, you know, 20 bands who've done it by now. But,
yeah, and that was one of my goals with that album too, was to touch on characters and themes that aren't typically sung about. You know, like you think of Elric and Conan, and a lot of bands, you know, cover those. So I wanted to do different ones, and that's why I did Jirel of Joiry, and I did Nifft the Lean by Michael Shea, which I've never heard anybody talk about. Some kind of obscure Clark Ashton Smith poems, The Hills of the Dead. I wanted to do a tribute to Michael Moorcock, and instead of singing about Elric, I chose to sing about his very first hero, his Sword and Planet hero, Sojan the Swordsman. So yeah, I tried to cover topics that, you know, other people didn't, just to bring awareness to people. You know, some different stuff that they might not have been exposed to, because, you know, if it's already been done so many times, it's like, and there's all these other, you know, great stories to sing about, then why not choose something different? So that's what I tried to go for with that.
Definitely. So you mentioned those four. You mentioned the Solomon Kane story, the C.L. Moore story, and there's the Shea story, and then there's that obscure Michael Moorcock Sword and Planet story. But now the other songs on the album, what did they refer to?
Yeah, so there's a few that are these sort of interlude type.
Yep, sorry.
Like, they're still very checking out as a song, especially themes behind them. So I did two Clark Ashton Smith themed ones. That is Ludar's Litany to Poseidon, and also the Eldritch Dark. Then there is a piece before Hellsguard, which is the story based on Jirel of Joiry. There's a piece before that called Jirel Meets Magic, and that is, of course, she has that's the name of one of the tales, and a really good one that I really enjoy. I wanted to kind of add that, so that's in there. Then there's a Edgar Allan Poe themed Mask of the Red Death thing. I had my good friend David Keltz. He's an Edgar Allan Poe interpreter and impersonator, and he does these really great character voices, so I had him kind of narrate the piece. So that's fun. Then there's a song I did. Yeah, it's a song I wrote with the keyboardist Keith years ago, and had it on the back burner. This really long song called "The Dark Kingdom" ended up being a duet between me and David DeFay from Virgin Steel, a good friend of mine. He appeared on there, so that was really fun. That song is the only original concept that I came up with for that, and that deals with just this kind of gothic atmosphere surrounding this part in the old Eternal Winter concept story that wrote way back at, in the beginning of the band. I wrote that right around the same time I wrote that thing I always speak about when we talk about Karnov and the influence. This song, it was called "In the Night Side of the Forest Black," and I wrote those lyrics that had to do with Karnov and the Phantom Clad Rider. So it has a similar atmosphere. A lot of this kind of dark gothic stuff surrounding this black forest and vampires and things. It's just an original tale. So that pretty much covers it. Then there's a song called "Victor of 100 Battles," and that one is a historical piece about Vercingetorix. He's like this Gaelic warlord that fought against Caesar back in the Roman times, and that's I included that because even though it's not fiction, it has a really barbaric sword and sorcery kind of attitude. Reminds me of like Howard's stuff when he would write about the Roman soldiers and whatnot and things going on. So so that's basically it for the collection, and that's it.
I got you. That's good to know. Okay, so as far as so historical battles, and I'm a big fan of that. On it was originally on Anaram Shall Fall. Of course, you sang on the re-recording of those sessions, which was Legacy of Atlantean Kings, and I had a song called Clontarf about the battle in 1014 when Brian Boru vanquished the Vikings and sent them running out of Ireland. Right. So I personally, I like a lot of that stuff. And at one time, and what you do is definitely what I call sword and sorcery heavy metal. But I like to have a song or two in there every now and then about just an iconic battle that occurred, what hundreds or thousands of years ago. So that's really awesome that you brought that up.
Thanks, Hal. When you did Clontarf, was that inspired by Howard's is it The Grey God Passes?
It was inspired by that, and as well I had read Morgan Llewellyn's Lion of Ireland, and Morgan Llewellyn is of course a female author. She's Welsh, I believe she's Welsh, and she writes these tales set during these different cycles of Irish mythology as well as Irish myth and legend. Cool. And so some really good stuff if you're into Irish mythology. At one time, I wanted to set every cycle. There are 3 cycles of Irish mythology. There is the Book of Conquest. There is the Finn McCool. That's the 3rd cycle. The 2nd cycle is the ones that concern the hero Cuchulainn. And then the 3rd cycle deals with the Finn McCool. So some really interesting books. You ever get a chance to check those out? But the Howard story too left an impression on me. The Grey God Passes as well. So that's sort of what inspired that.
Yeah, that collection. What is it? Martyrs of Valhalla, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's excellent. All kinds of kind of like Sowers of the Thunder with a lot of cool historical references. I guess he was really tapping into that. I guess what he was into, that like Harold Lamb adventure style fiction, and really good stuff.
Yeah, like I said, he was writing these historical type. It was historical fiction, but also he was very much influenced by that, like the Harold Lamb type stuff, as well as the supernatural horror and gothic horror and even the cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft. So Howard created this thing, and I mentioned earlier that really defined it was the story, The Shadow Kingdom, in 1929, and the August issue of Weird Tales. And then the next month after that was The Mirrors of Tuzun Thun.
Yeah.
Which was another Kull tale. And as far as I can tell, those are the only two Kull tales that Weird Tales published. You know, there was By This Axe I Rule, which he wrote and Farnsworth Wright rejected. So he rewrote it, and it became The Phoenix on the Sword, which was the first Conan story published. It was in 1932.
Yeah, I believe a lot of those Kull tales got rejected. I think I've read before, which is strange because those are some of my very favorites. I love the Kull stories.
Yeah, me as well. Yeah, definitely.
I'm going to go back to those even more so than the Conan stuff. Some of those stories, some of them have wild themes. I think it's is it called Del Carde's Cat, the one where he's goes under the water and all that, and has that whole thing that's really cool.
Yeah, with the talking cat.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I love Kull. Really good stuff.
Yeah. So anyway, The Hills of the Dead was a relatively short story. So there's not a whole lot to discuss without giving away, just putting spoilers out there for people, which I really don't want to do. Some of the guys have read all this stuff and they'll watch it, just because they enjoy us talking about it. But there are some guys, one guy commented just recently, and maybe yesterday, that he had just gotten into sword and sorcery, and this was, a really great podcast because he could learn a lot of things from it. So I don't want to spoil it for those guys. But do you have anything else that you think we should talk about regarding the Hills of the Dead, or somewhat related to that?
I think it's definitely a tale worth seeking out and reading. As all the Solomon Kane stuff, it is one of my very favorites, along with a few other ones. And like you said, some of them have supernatural elements and some don't. Wings in the Night is another really good one that I would recommend checking out. And Solomon Kane has a lot of cool adaptions too. There were graphic, there were comics, black and white comics that were, drawn back in. I think they were included in the Savage Sword Conan magazines, and also they were in Dracula Lives. That was another big magazine at the time. Horror comic kind of thing. There were several in there too, and they published them in anthologies. And they're really cool. So, for guys that like comics and whatnot, there's cool Solomon Kane stuff in that area as well, and cool adaptions of this story that we're talking about. I mean, I can go on forever talking about this stuff. And, I love the story. I would recommend, probably, I did not do this, but I would say if someone was going to read this story, maybe they would want to read Red Shadows first, and I believe that one is like kind of it's not novella length, but it reads like that with chapters. It's a little bit longer, because these events follow it. And I don't think you have to read the first one first, because I didn't, but it might be cool. So I would maybe.
From what I remember, now Red Shadows didn't have any supernatural elements, though, did it?
Well, when the Voodoo Man resurrects the corpse with the voodoo staff.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. It's been a while since I've read those. I've been reading this stuff since the '80s, early '80s. At least the Conan stuff, and then I got more really focused on reading a lot of this stuff. I guess in the early '90s is when I read most of the Howard Sword and Sorcery, and a lot of the stuff that he wrote that wasn't Sword and Sorcery. I was trying to read. I was just so impressed with Robert E. Howard that I wanted to read everything that he wrote, and even if it wasn't a genre I would normally read, like westerns.
Right.
Yeah, and he wrote.
I read his pirate tales. What's that guy's name? His pirate character.
Oh, White Mia.
Yeah. I really like those. Those are really good.
Yeah, those are good.
I got into a couple non-sword and sorcery, books that he did too. Mm-hmm. It's all really good.
One of my favorites are the Crusader stories, and a character I really, really wish he would have written more about is Cormac Fitzgeoffrey, he's basically Conan the Crusader. he wrote these stories around the same time he started getting on a roll with those Conan stories. And I lost you there, Matt. There you are.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, that's all right. Okay, so anyway, he wrote these Crusader stories, and to me, that's some of his finest writing. Of course, none of that, they're historical, they're action-packed stories, but they don't really have any kind of supernatural, weird elements to them. But they're still great stories. And there were only two of those Cormac Fitzgeoffrey stories. There was I think it was Blood of Belshazzar and the Hawks of Outremer, and then there was a fragment that was unfinished called the Prince's Slave. But anyway, yeah. So I digress. Do we want to talk any more about the Hills of the Dead, or do you want to go ahead and wrap it up?
I'm good. Like I said, I just glad to talk about it and revisit one of my very favorite pulp sword and sorcery tales. It was a lot of fun. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And now, as far as archaic lore enshrined, viewers who are interested in checking that out can go to the Eternal Winter Bandcamp page and listen to these songs, right? And they totally for free. They can go over there and listen to the Hills of the Dead and any of these stories you've discussed.
Right, sure. Yeah, I think it's as easy as bandcamp.eternalwinter.com or something like that. Yeah, you can go on and check it out, or it's all on YouTube, and the album's available. And yeah, I encourage people to check, people that are into these sword and sorcery stories, check out albums like that. I mean, Archaic Lore Enshrined or Legacy of Atlantean Kings, by Cauldron Born, another sword and sorcery heavy metal masterpiece. That's where it's at. So yeah.
All right. Well, with that being said, this has been Matthew Knight and Howie Bentley for Sword and Sorcery Heavy Metal. And be sure to tune in next week for the next episode.
All right. Cheers.
See you, Matt. Cheers, man.